Welcome to Navigating the New Normal, Episode 5, Connectivity on the Go for All. I am excited to have Morgan Lloyd here with us, who is an employee of Khajiit, a former educator. She is born and raised in NC, and we can't wait to talk about connectivity on the go and your perspective on how students, patrons, as well as educators can benefit from access to technologies. Next slide, please. Who are we? We are Khajiit. We believe in digital equity and that students should be able to learn no matter where they choose to study. So, for those of you that are joining our webinar and you've had the opportunity to be on our webinar for several episodes, this stands true and it rings true. And it is truly what we believe. No matter where a child is, they should be able to be connected and have that access. And that is a part of what Khajiit wants to bring to education as well as to other entities as we provide connectivity solutions. We are 20 years in to our connectivity solutions, and we've been able to partner with several organizations. So being able to provide that digital equity support is one of those things that we pride ourselves on. And as we start today's webinar, we're going to talk a little bit about what that looks like for students, for patrons, as well as for educators. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned earlier, my name is Krystle Pearson, and I am the Senior Marketing Manager for the education team here at Khajiit, and I am your webinar host for today. Along with me is Morgan Lloyd. Morgan is the Director of Public Sales, Sector Sales for the South region for Khajiit. She was born and raised in North Carolina. She is a former D2 college athlete, and she has a master's in communications. She currently lives in Virginia, where she, as I mentioned before, is the Director of Public Sector Sales here at Khajiit. She manages a team and supports school districts and other public sector entities as she helps to bridge the digital divide. With over 7 years of experience in education as a former educator and 6 years of experience working in ed tech and telecommunications sales, I am just excited to have her here with me today. In addition, she was previously a renewal specialist for IXL Learning, where her focus was on customer retention and customer support. So, Morgan, I'm going to give you a chance to just kind of talk a little bit about what landed you here at Khajiit and some of the things that you've seen in your experience on being on this side of education and the impact that you're making in your role.
Thank you, Krystle, and thank you for having me. I'm super honored. I fresh out of college, I got my bachelor's in English and English communications, and I was a little like trying to find my place. Actually, my husband and I both were trying to find our place and like what we wanted to do. And this wonderful opportunity came about to do lateral entry into teaching. So with my English background, it was just a really easy move into education. And I did fall in love with it. And I was there for 7 years. Same district, same high school, which uniquely was the same high school or the same school district that I went to school in. So it was really nice to kind of come back to the community and pay it forward in a way. Um, in the end, I think I've been at Khajiit now for just over 5 years. I just hit my 5 year anniversary. And then I wasn't at IXL Learning, like you said before. I'm a year prior to coming to Khajiit, and it was really just um, looking for a new challenge. I will say that I was a teacher from 2010 to 2017, so there are some current challenges that I did not have to face, and I don't know how teachers do it today. I feel like there are still some of the same challenges from when I was teaching, even though it kind of seems like eons ago at this point. But definitely digital equity it was a problem then. And I say a problem, but it's really just like a goal, really. And it still is today, even after COVID and learning kind of what that divide actually looks like.
Gotcha. Okay. All right. So as we move on to our next slide, We're going to talk a little bit about impact. And it's interesting that you said that you were a native because I actually, that was my background as well. My previous school district, when I was a director of technology, I was a native. I was born and raised there, and I left, went to college, came back, and wanted to give back to my community. And although we were a rural district and a little bit of a smaller size compared to other districts, our need and our impact was still the same. We still needed resources. We still needed technology. Our students still needed access. And during my course of being there, we were able to build our one-to-one program. But funding was an issue. Of course, device sustainability. We were in a position where we received the devices in 2019 and we were ready to roll. And then March of 2020 hit, and it was like, oh my gosh, now we have to send all of these devices home. And how are we going to manage that? What does that look like for students and teachers and parents? And how are we educating those? So, as we talk about our first question, let's look at the need for one-to-one. How do you believe districts can continue to address the need for one-to-one programs and device sustainability?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's so funny you mentioned that in 2019, you guys were on the cusp of your one-to-one program. I say that it's so funny because you were probably one of the lucky ones. Because most school districts were not even close to being one-to-one. My district was a Title One district, and the high school I taught at was a Title One high school. We were not one-to-one. I remember having a schedule for just the English department. I mean, there were 5 or 6 of English teachers across the high school, and we were sharing 2 laptop carts. So being able to send a device home was not even an option. So we had to do more of like a flipped classroom option where, you would do the work in the class and then almost like do kind of the studying at home. Like it was really flip flop because we didn't have that ability. Um, I assume after COVID, there have been plenty of resources and funding available federally to make some of that happen. So I hope a lot of schools did take advantage of that. Because truly, I think one-to-one has been the goal for quite some time. And you mentioned sustainability. I've heard from many school districts throughout, because I was actually in the account manager role in 2019, 2020 here at Khajiit. So I was really in the trenches with school districts trying to make sure that we got devices out to them for connectivity. And I would just, talk to them and they would just share their challenges because we're also, by providing a Khajiit solution, we're providing an additional piece of technology. So, they're telling me how they currently keep track of their devices, and they would tell me there was at some point they were just handing out devices because they didn't have time to track it. So, I think now where we are in 2023, I think a lot of school districts are kind of coming back to base, figuring out what their inventory looks like so that they can actually move forward with what they originally probably planned for their one-to-one programs. Um, then when we talk about device sustainability, there's a few different buckets for this. Obviously, funding is the first. Because once you become a one-to-one district, it's not like you get these laptops and you're good to go. They don't last forever.
That's right.
And you probably know from your experience, I love my students. I love my kiddos is what I would call them. But they are rough. They are rough on devices, and just in general, bringing them back and forth, they just naturally, they get a little banged up in the way. So that plus just longevity of an actual piece of equipment that has to be replaced. So the only way to truly make something sustainable, like a one-to-one program, is to build it into your budget.
That's right.
And I think that's just number one. And now the budgets are very different across, geographically, just, across many school districts, but there are other funding sources that can be utilized. Title One, McKinney-Vento funds. It just really depends on your population, but I think that's probably the best starting point, finding the right funding and getting it into your budget on a yearly basis, or even, some device refreshes are every 2 to 3 years, whatever fits best for the district.
So, in my district, we were like up to our eyeballs in devices. It was like, oh my goodness, we went from, not being a one-to-one to, at the conclusion of my tenure there in my district, we ended up being a 2-to-1. And as I said, we were very small, but, a lot of, although COVID was unexpected, there were some benefits on the education side for technologies because of COVID. And I can remember having the devices, and as you say, you have these devices, and they're like little pockets of gold because they're a resource that you have and you want the students to use them. But then some educators and some district leaders are on the line of, I want them to use them, but I really don't want them to damage them. So finding that balance was one of those things for our district, that we had to make sure we had appropriate insurance coverage. We had to make sure that after our 1 year support coverage for our devices, what was our plan for sustainability? Because most devices, you get that 1 year service plan, but if you have a device that's going to last you 5 or 6 years, how do you handle your coverage plan after that? So that was something that we definitely had to look into. Reporting was so important. um as you mentioned before, you would give them the device, they had the devices, and the tracking system may not been the best tracking system, because it was kind of like we were building a plane and flying it at the same time. When everything
Blowing the
happened, we didn't
wings
know what we
on,
were
as
going
they
to do.
say.
Yeah. It's like, oh, you got the device. Okay, now you need the username and the password. Now you need the training support. So there was
Yep.
a lot that was in it to be able to sustain the devices. And one of the districts that I remember working with, that was a neighboring district, they came up with a refresh cycle. So every so often, if it was third grade, this was their year to be refreshed, and it may be third, fifth, and eighth graders, it was their year to be refreshed. Or you may have had another grade level where it was their year to be refreshed. So developing that cycle really helped them to be able to have that sustainability. And the devices kind of traveled with the student. If they were a ninth grader, then that ninth grade device was the same device they had on their senior year. So that there are so many different ways of doing that. But I definitely agree with you. Proper planning, putting into your budget, that is extremely important. And we know that budgets change from time to time, but we do know that the need for connectivity is something that hasn't changed. That has become a constant. So
Yeah.
thank you for that, because that it's amazing to see how we have these devices, and it's like, okay, now that I have them, how am I going to maintain them? How am I going to keep them? You don't want to give them technology and then take it away, and being able to support that.
Yeah, and you brought up a really good point too about not just we have them, here you go, you're one to one, you're good to go, but just in general having a small technology staff, which many districts do. They can't support troubleshooting calls. They can't do everything because they're already asked to do so much as it is. And I think it's important too when looking for your actual one-to-one program and like building out that plan, find a vendor that can offset some of that responsibility and just some of that um help, like that end user support. I think that's really important too, because you want to make sure that you are I would say making the funds, utilized as best as possible.
And it's interesting that you say that, because a lot of times, when we, as district leaders in IT, or even as central office leaders, sometimes we forget to know what to ask vendors, and we'll make a purchase, and then it's like, oh my goodness, I didn't think about this and I didn't think about that. So I always encourage educators, when they're in the seat of being able to have that purchasing power, to find out what other districts those vendors are working with. Are they in close proximity? What has been their review of them? What's the goal? And how does that work for your sustainability plan? Is this a one-time support, or am I going to get tier support? Will I be able to call them when I have a device that's not working? Do they provide, that support that you need? Because oftentimes you get the device, and as you say, you get them and you give it to them, and then for some situations, you don't always get a chance to have that intimate contact with your vendors, and have that support. So that is important with your sustainability.
Yeah.
So let's move on to question number two. And as we talk about resources and we think about connectivity, let's talk a little bit about what resources that you've seen in your experience, in both inside the classroom and outside of the classroom, that are available to keep students and even patrons connected on the go.
Yeah, so I would say what we're seeing a rise in now are two things. Number one, just the embedded device in general, the LTE embedded device. Um, because it is, if you're thinking about a one-to-one program and you're also thinking about an additional piece of hardware, which for us at Khajiit would be a smart spot. That's another piece of equipment that you will have to inventory, track,
Mm.
And then you have to figure out need and, make sure that you have to physically hand it to the student. So a lot of conversations we're having, kind of post, I would say, the ECF world, and trying to make these programs more sustainable as kind of that federal funding dies down a little bit, is moving towards an embedded device to, number one, cut down on, like I said, inventory, just manpower, just keeping up with a second physical device, but then also just streamlining, um, connectivity for all students, because I think a lot of people think now that, like, just the digital divide is just like a certain particular student, but there's so many other ways to think about it. I think one area would be like athletics.
Mm.
From a district where I'm from, it's very rural, and I mean plenty other districts. You have games, 2 or 3 games a week sometimes, and you're on a bus. You're on a bus for hours at a time. So, you know, that is valuable homework time that could be utilized while you're on the bus, especially from high school students. Like, I know you said in my bio that I was on a D2 athlete. Yes, I was. I was also a high school softball coach. And I would have loved if
To
they would
have
have their.
devices like that, right?
Yes, yes, so they could have been doing their homework on the bus, while I was driving. That would have been nice. Like, as a driver, I think I would have appreciated that most. Because there were nights where we would get back really late, and like all they want to do is go to sleep when they could have had 2 hours on the bus. Even doing like study hall hours. So to
Mhm.
me, that's also an extension of the digital divide. Um, in addition to that, if a school is not able to do like the embedded device, or if they're not into their refresh, um year, there's also the smart bus option, putting the
Right.
router on the bus, like, and we do those for athletic buses as well, because it's just making the most of that time. I will never forget this. I was chatting with a district. I think it was like probably late 2021. 2020 was a blur sometimes, but it was like late 2021. They felt like things were getting much better, and it was kind of like the quote unquote, like, kind of phasing out of COVID, right? Or at least we were hoping at the time. And we were talking about the smart bus option. They were like, one of the main reasons we really want to do this is because we've spent the last, year and a half, that time at home with, this normally spent with mom, dad, family time, has just completely turned into school. And like, we want to give them that time back, right? So if we can give them time on the bus to do their homework, that's less they have to do at home, and then they can kind of take back the home. Like, I don't know, it was just an interesting take on connectivity on the go, because it wasn't just about the digital divide. It was like, we want to, flip the mindset of,
Right.
at home, like that break, because their home was their school for over a year. And I think that was taxing for everyone, the students, the parents, teachers. So I thought that was really interesting.
It's interesting that you mentioned the LTE embedded option because I can recall when we did our device deployment, we had students, every child received a Chromebook, but we did like a shared hotspot for the household. And having something like a LTE embedded option would have been great during that time because a lot of families had to choose. You may have had an older child who was at the age where they could stay at home by themselves and they could keep themselves. And then you had the younger child who had to go to grandma's house or had to go to daycare doing
Yeah.
virtual learning time. And parents were having to choose which child could have access to the hotspot. But having that embedded option, every child gets access to that hotspot because it's built into that device. So that is something that I do think that that's an invaluable resource to have. And then even thinking about patrons and you're thinking about on the go and just being able to have, the connectivity and that access as you're heading out or you're going to visit someone or you're on a vacation and you don't have to worry about, oh my gosh, am I going to have internet? Am I going to have
Yeah.
connectivity? You have that all built in for you in one. So,
Yeah.
yes, thank you for
Even
sharing that.
even for me, just as a an employee somewhere, like, I love the ability to be able to work in, anywhere remote that I need to be able to work, whether we go to trade shows. So I often think about teachers who, they do professional development, and
Yeah.
sometimes it's off site and you don't know what you're going to get when you get there. So I think that's really important too, just thinking about staff members as well. Um, because they have connectivity needs too.
Right. We were talking recently. I was talking with a colleague about, public Wi-Fi and a former colleague, and she was saying, sometimes when I go to these conferences and the first thing that I do is I connect my device to the Wi-Fi. She was like, and I don't really think about the security piece. I just connect it. And I'm like, well, are you using a district device? And she's like, yeah, because I have to get, connectivity and access. And it's like, oh man, if you had a device that was already built in that was kind of monitored by your district, it's so much of a more secure solution for you to be able to do so than have to, because I love public Wi-Fi, but to have to rely on some of those pieces as well. So just having that level of intimate security for your K-12 solution is one of those resources that is honestly invaluable when you're thinking about connectivity on the go.
Yeah, and I was going to say too, I think one of the uh, another conversation I had in probably 2020, 2021, I there was a school district, I think they were kind of torn about being service providers and those things, and they're like, oh, well, they can, they can use the McDonald's Wi-Fi or the Starbucks Wi-Fi. And I just remember thinking, like, where I'm from, I couldn't just walk to those places. It's so rural. Like, the closest McDonald's is 5 miles away from me. Like, not, it's just not like walkable. It's not like in a,
Right.
in a more urban area. Um, and I just thought, like, if they could get to and from like an area with public Wi-Fi, like they could probably afford their own connectivity. So like it's a great resource if you can get to it, but a lot of kids just
Right.
cannot get to it, you
Definitely.
know?
Yeah. Yeah, and definitely, being able to that's so true. It's almost like zip code barriers where sometimes you'll have students that don't have connectivity just because of their where they live, but you
Yep.
may go 10 miles down the road or you may go one county over and the equitable opportunities are so much greater for students. So definitely yeah, you're right because you don't
Yeah.
always have the Starbucks to be able to get to have that Wi-Fi solution.
I know. I know we all
So
wish we could walk to a Starbucks at any time, right?
right,
But
right. So we're going to go ahead and move on to question number 3. And this is our final question to talk about organizations, districts, and support. So, in your experience, what are a few ways that districts can support and or work with local agencies for their connectivity solutions?
yeah, so we're seeing a few things. I will say I've seen some interesting use cases with the local housing authorities. They've been really great working with school districts to identify specific areas where students live that might need access. There's like common areas in some the apartment complexes, and they will actually allow the school district to, get a router through us and put that in the common area, and they kind of lock down the password so like just those students know it, and it's like their own personal Wi-Fi. So that's a really interesting use case. We've seen a few YMCA organizations and churches, like local churches. They will kind of open their doors to like after school study hours, and they'll do a very similar kind of, I would say, like the router in there, but it's very specific to those students, so not everyone can use it, because I think that's, like you said earlier, it's about like having your own access. You're not having to like pull and share, the bandwidth, right? Because that's already an
Right.
issue in many areas. And then probably the biggest push we're seeing is that our local libraries are actually starting their own lending programs, and that's available to anyone in the household. Parents, students. There's even very specific adult and senior programs that we have now. So yeah, we're seeing a lot of community involvement. But I think the local libraries has been one of the largest, because they're really trying to fill that void, where students are, or school districts are a bit exhausted at this point,
Yeah.
with connectivity. So
And I guess and finding the appropriate resource because I know for most districts being able to have that connection is great, but when you can do it as a community, because you have some students that may go to the YMCA in the evening or they may have to go to a particular area or community center, so having that resource is always great. I remember working with a district and they're actually a customer of Khajiit, and they use the smart spots and the routers and they put them into, as you said, faith-based organizations, and they kind of essentially turned them into like little internet cafes. So it was kind
I
of cool
love
to
that.
see students to be able to go and have that access, or they were strategically placing buses in different areas so that students could kind of drive up. But of course, they had to kind of connect and work with their local government to make sure it's okay for us to place this bus here so that students will have access. So even the onset of like Wi-Fi enabled benches and park areas, recreational areas, there are so many opportunities to collaborate. And it takes a village, because when you're talking about connectivity on the go, everyone has to be on board with that. So
Yeah.
those are some great resources that you shared about that.
Absolutely. And I think there's even some, this is a fairly newer topic for us, but there are some state and local governments that are looking at kind of what they call last mile efforts,
Mhm.
which we support with our PLTE solution. And so it's really areas where cellular is not even covering that. So they're really digging in and like you said, making it more of a community approach to make sure their entire community is connected, which I think is great.
Digging in deep. Yeah, yeah. So that's going to wrap it up for us. Thank you so much, Morgan, for joining us.
Thank you
I
for
just
having
love, I
me.
could talk education with you all day.
I
I always
know.
say you can take the teacher out of the classroom, but you cannot take the classroom out of the teacher. So I'm so
Never.
glad to have you here.
Thank you so much.
And everything that you shared. It's always interesting seeing education from the K-12 side and then our impact on the corporate side and how, you think that you're touching students in the classroom and you are, and then you get to this side of it and it's like, oh my gosh, I can expand my reach across the United States. So I'm so
Yeah.
excited that you were able to come and share a little bit about what you do here at Khajiit and what you've seen and the impact and how we can continue to help bridge the digital divide.
Thank you so much for having me. Anytime I can talk about my time as an educator, like I'm here for it always. It
Awesome,
holds a special
awesome.
place in my heart. I love the work that we do. I'm here at Khajiit, but those years in education, they're just so special. So
Yes.
yeah.
Well, this is Krystle Pearson. I am signing off on Navigating the New Normal Connectivity on the Go for All, episode 5. As we continue to address the digital divide here at Khajiit, we invite you to join our other episodes that will be coming up, as well as visit our website at www.khajiit.com for additional information on how we can support your connectivity solution needs. Thank you once again, Morgan, and we are out.